Hey everybody, how you doing? Welcome to another episode of the Senate Update. It's been a minute. I'm your host, MangryGamer, accompanied by my fellow co-host, Mr. LabMonkey. Lab, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great tonight. Thanks for asking.
Awesome, man. Well, so Lab and I wanted to get together and do another kind of a guide episode on kind of two huge milestones in the early and mid games for guilds and for players looking to kind of advance their roster and kind of get over the next hurdle into kind of mid game content and into end game content. And those two big milestones are heroic Sith raid and GODS territory battles. So those are the two big kind of hurdles that you kind of drive towards in the early and mid game, both from a player and guild perspective. So from a guild perspective, Lab, so we're looking at 80 million minimum for GODS, right? And then HSTR, well, doesn't have a hard minimum cap. I feel like you'll hit that around the same spot depending on squads. You think that's fair to say?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, every guild is going to be different, right? And depending on what early game squads the players in their guilds are farming up will determine how early they're set up to be able to take down the heroic raid. But yeah, I mean, I remember when Ryloth was going through it, we were doing ours. I think we were 70 something million, and that was before some of the big time squads like this new gas team that I'll talk about a little bit later. The JTR team with 3PO and Rex. Those teams, I mean, those will shred half of the raid by themselves, and this was before any of that came out. So, yeah, I mean, it completely depends on how focused your guild is, but I'd say that's a pretty decent benchmark about when you would kind of start to see signs of being able to take that thing down.
Perfect. Yeah, and just for context here, so Lab helped lead his guild at the time, Ryloth, through these two milestones as GL, and I did the same for Tatooine, which is the guild that my alt is in, and so we've been through this before. And the interesting thing with it is that every guild is going to be a little bit different going through each one of them, and how you want to set up depending on the squad compositions that you have. So we figured we'd put this together as kind of a guide to help, even if you're a guild leader, guild officer listening to this, even if you're not just in this for your own individual roster, we thought that'd be a useful episode to do. So that way, it may make your life easier leading your own guild through those two hurdles. Let's say you're a 40, 50 million guild looking at these on the horizon, or ideally, if you're a lower guild or lower level account, you're planning ahead for these to be hitting these with the ground running, to make the most of it. So, and the reason why we emphasize on these two, both from a player perspective and a guild perspective, guilds want to be able to do these events and do them well, because the rewards are very good, and they turn out to be very good recruiting tools. HSTR, just being able to clear it at all, has great rewards. And on the GODS side, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but it's a huge source of get to currency, as well as just great overall rewards. And if your guild does eventually get the capability of getting watt shards, that's another thing that you see advertised for and recruited, kind of focused around those numbers. So the better you do with these events, the better kind of recruits that you're going to get as a guild leader or guild officer. And as a player, the better you can contribute towards these events, the more valuable you are as a player. So we'll get into kind of the player perspective and guild perspective, guild leader, officer perspective, for each of these events, and kind of, work through it that way. So Lab, why don't we start off with HSTR? I know you're an aficionado, as you've even been able to merc it lately for a couple of our lower guilds in our alliance. So I'm going to kick it over to you for a little bit to kind of take the driver's seat here for HSTR. But so what do you think, man? For a player and a guild leader officer, what are the big things you want to, either farm towards or look towards for that?
Sure. So, just for a little bit of context, the reason that I am, as you say, an aficionado of HSTR is because very early on, when I was an officer in Ryloth, not even leading yet, but just an officer, I uh, I ascertained that the heroic Sith raid at the time was the major hurdle that our guild needed to get over in order to become a quote unquote serious guild. And what I mean by that is, um, I mean, we were serious before that, but in order to do some of those things that you've already hinted at, to recruit actual good, talented players, um, players who have an already fairly well developed roster, you have to have the capability to do this raid, simply because the amount of G12 and G12 plus gear and salvage that it rewards you with is unmatched in any of the other modes. You might get, more in your loot box for an entire week's worth of a territory battle, but by then you've already done a second Sith raid in that amount of time. So consistently, if your guild is not doing the heroic Sith raid, you are losing out on a lot of gear and a lot of progress that you should be making, quite frankly. Um, so, anyways, that's uh, I I pushed heavily for Ryloth um, to have our players farm the correct teams in order to be able to beat this raid, and any early or even casual or half casual guilds that are out there that haven't taken it down yet. This should be your number one priority because of that gear and that progress that you're missing out on by not clearing it. Because the difference between tier 6 and heroic rewards uh, are huge.
It is a
It's
big jump.
it's
Yeah.
it's ridiculous. So with that in mind, I wanted to say a couple of things about why guild leaders and officers should be pushing for this. And I've already alluded to the recruiting aspect and the the fact that it is a major source of progress. So if you're whether your guild is looking to be a territory war focused guild or a territory battle focused guild, or if you are looking to be an all around guild, no matter what you want to do, in order to get the progress across the board on your guild members, if you want their rosters to be able to be pushed at any sort of reasonable rate, you have to be doing this raid. That's cut and dry. That's how it is. If you're not doing the heroic Sith raid, then your guild is losing out on too much progress. So, before you push really anything else, and even in today's game, I mean, the heroic Sith raid is it's 2.5 years old now. It was released in February of 2018. It's 2.5 years old now, and it's still the best source of gear for G12 and G12 plus. So if you want to push those relics, you need to do this. Um,
Yep.
as far as leadership goes, I highly encourage that you help guide your players to construct some of these early game teams that I'm about to go through to help take down this raid as soon as possible. And luckily enough, these teams are not just one trick pony teams. These teams are that I'm going to recommend are valuable in basically every single game mode. So you're double, triple, quadruple dipping when you are gearing them up. Um, so let's talk about, as an individual player, what sort of teams do you want to create to gear up first in order to not only help your guild take down the raid, but also to take one of those top damage slots that rewards the much more valuable gear. Um, and remember, this is the major gear source that you're going to have outside. I mean, it rewards guild tokens, which is the guild currency is very valuable in getting
For sure.
garbantes and stun cuffs and all that stuff that you really need. But also the gear itself. I mean, even just one drop of a fully crafted Gear 12 item is something like 4,000 or 5,000 crystals worth of gear. So even if you only get it once a month, or a couple of times a month if you're lucky, you are vastly outpacing anybody who is not getting that sort of gear drop. So I've rambled a bit here, but
Oh, I totally agree. All that plus Treya on top of that is
right.
a big perk in itself too.
Yeah,
Just like the other raids, that you're gonna get a solid character out of it by getting the heroic.
it's true. And Treya, I mean, obviously she's like 5 metas ago at this point, but she's still an excellent leader. In Grand Arena and Territory Wars, she's basically like my trump card. Um, I don't just put her on Geonosian duty, although she is quite good at Geonosian duty if you have a well-developed Scion. But she can pretty much take out any non-meta team, including stuff like Padme. So I mean, Jedi Knight Revan, probably not Darth Revan. Probably the line is there between Padme and Darth Revan, but
Yeah.
anything under Darth Revan, she can reliably take out. And so it's really nice if you kind of get thrown that curveball in Grand Arena or Territory Wars where, oh shoot, I forgot to plan for that team, and now here it is staring at me in the face. What am I supposed to do? That's kind of what I keep Treya for. So very, very valuable character. So let's talk about the teams that I recommend. And just to give you an idea about how important it is to have the right teams instead of just like, your favorite teams. I personally, I only use 2 teams in every heroic Sith raid that I run. And in indoor, anytime we run a Sith raid, I take first place in it, and I
You
only run
sure
2
do.
teams. I run. I average somewhere between 100 and 120 million, depending on how good my runs go. But I run the gas variant of the clones team, which I'll describe here in a minute. And that is good enough to completely solo P1 and get through half of P2. And then I run the Night Sister Anakin team to completely solo P3 and put a decent dent into P4. So with just those teams, I'm taking first place with every single raid. Now, obviously, once we get more Supreme Little Leader Kylo Rens, I'll probably end up not taking first anymore since he can solo the raid. But for
Yeah.
now, these 2 teams have served me well. They don't take a lot of time to run. I would say they take about 15 minutes altogether in terms of me having to babysit them, and then another 10 minutes or so of the Night Sister team kind of just doing its thing.
Doing their thing. Yeah. I literally just had that on auto when we started recording this. So. My
Right,
Alta course, because that's why I'm not up in the top 5 of Endor's HSTR.
So, anyways, that's my background as far as what I like to use. As far as what early game teams you should be farming if you want to do well in this raid, and like I said before, you do want to do well in this raid, I have 3 suggestions. The first suggestion is just a straight up clones team. You don't even need Shock T, although Shock T does help boost your score a lot.
Yep.
But she's stuck behind, table 5 fleet node, and that's not accessible for a lot of early game players. So just clones with Rex lead is great. The all the damage that you do is with Rex. I mean, all the other clones are fairly negligible. You'll get a few 100,000 points in from Echo. but and fives, but the majority of the points are going to come from Rex's aerial assault. So all you have to do is basically try to get him as many turns as possible, and always use that ability on cooldown. It's best, in my opinion, in P1. So if you're a guild officer or a guild leader, and you're trying to rush as many teams as possible to take down P1, you really only need a handful of those clone teams. I think well-developed clone teams with low relics, or maybe even G12, if I'm remembering this right, they can do something like 8 to 10 million in P1 of the heroic Sith raid. So
Yep.
you really only need like 4 or 5 of those to completely solo that phase. Um, so yeah, clones, and I don't really have to. I'm not going to go into all the different reasons why clones are great, but um, if you're at all serious about the game, you need to level up your clones at some point. So you might as well do it early and start getting uh, good scores in your heroic Sith raid runs. Um, the second team that I'm going to recommend is Jedi Knight Revan. So if you're not on an early path to get those clones, that's okay. Jedi Knight Revan is another great early game farm. A lot of people still go after him, even though he's not the top of the meta anymore. And with him and Grandmaster Yoda together, and of course, you get bonus points if you've got Hermit Yoda in there. He boosts that score a lot, but even without him, Jedi Knight Revan does just fine. In pretty much any of the phases, you're going to get something like 8 to 10 million if you have decent gear levels and mods on these characters. And Hermit Yoda will boost that even further. Jedi Knight Revan is most potent on phase 2 of the raid. However, that is also the easiest phase of the raid. And so if you're a guild officer, you probably want to uh, save as many Jedi Knight Revans as you can for other more difficult phases, because he does shine in pretty much any phase that he is run. The third team that I'm going to recommend is Night Sisters, and I recommend them for several reasons. The first reason is because, as I said, I used a variant of the Night Sisters to completely solo P3, which means that, again, if you're an officer or a guild leader and you're trying to ramp up to take down that heroic Sith raid for the first time, all you need is one person who knows what they're doing with the Jedi Knight Anakin Night Sister team, and you can just completely write off P3 as being done.
Yep.
It's really probably the most efficient in terms of just needing one team to completely wipe out 25% of the raid. Night Sisters are also quite nice in P4, although it's a little bit more finicky, and you have to run a Saj lead instead of Talzin lead. But you can get a nice chunk off of Nihilus with the Night Sister team in P4 as well. So don't be afraid to have multiple Night Sister teams early on in your guild. Not only will they be nice in PvP and PvE, but they will help to take down P4 of the raid if you've already got somebody running the P3 Night Sister variant. The one other thing that I'll say about Night Sisters before I stop talking about early game teams is the fact that they are the easiest team to gear in the game. And this includes Night Sister Spirit as well. Spirit is ridiculously easy to gear. So if you're in that early part of the game, you want to be as efficient as possible building up those first few teams. Night Sisters are an excellent, excellent way to go. Probably not the very first team because you want to get started on your fleet, but when you're looking to round out your GAC teams, maybe get that third or fourth team, and you also want potency in the HSTR, I highly recommend checking out Night Sisters. They're very easy to gear, and they're very powerful. I use them all the time, not just in raids, but in Grand Arena and Territory Wars. They're awesome. So those are the 3 teams that I recommend early on. Go after at least one of them, and go after multiple ones if you're super serious about getting a high score in this raid. The Clones, Jedi Knight Revan, and Night Sisters. Before I go into the mid-late game, is there anything that you want to say about early game farms, or what you've seen some other people do as far as early HSTR takedowns?
No, I mean, I think those are the main teams that I would recommend too. I mean, they, like you said, with the clones, um, Rexley does just fine. And there's multiple variants that, like, even if you, depending on what you're farming out of Cantina, you could put off Arc for a while and run it with either with Cody in there or do the other 350 first with Sergeant, because he's a pilot too, so it's not wasted gear or anything like that. Along with some other GR tunes. So I've done it with R2 does pretty well in there if you're not running R2 with JTR, as well as Ahsoka does well in there if you're not using her with a Jedi team. There's a lot of other teams that do well in P2. Even a Padme that a lot of people farm early will get you decent damage, but the ones that you said are definitely the top, and definitely like clones are the fastest building out of all of that. I feel like, and like you said, Night Sisters are. I don't find that as many people build those out of the gate these days, but like you said, they're definitely a valuable team if you can fit them into your farming path. And definitely it's nice, like you said, being able to solo P3 with it. It's definitely handy to have at least one of those. A couple of those teams rocking in the guild is definitely super helpful.
So I'm
Yeah,
glad that you mentioned Arc Trooper because he really is garbage in raids because they don't let him summon his turret.
true. That is true. I don't even have them on either my account. It's
Yeah.
next on the docket, but
Yeah, I
yeah,
don't even so like I use clones and Shakti to solo the tank raid as well, and I don't bring Arc Trooper because again he sucks in raids because he doesn't summon his turret. So I slap C3PO in there instead, and you can solo the tank raid on auto with that team. So yeah, Arc Trooper. I'm not saying don't farm him because Arc Trooper is really good, and you really want him in your gas team eventually. And also, you have to have him to be able to farm Kiadi Mundi shards. But early on, if getting to that raid as fast as possible is your target, don't farm Arc Trooper right away. Farm some other clone or use R2 or whatever.
makes sense to me.
All right, so let me just talk real quick then about mid and late game teams that the player is going to want to acquire if they want to consistently do well. So I've got four other things for you. The first thing is Shakti. So you definitely want those clones that I was talking about in the early game. You probably won't be able to get to Shakti until a much later time. Shakti is an amazing, versatile character. You will never waste gear on her. You will always have a place to use her, whether it's in. You know what? Honestly, I don't even need to name off all the modes. She's great in every single mode.
She really
And
is.
she's in she goes in like 3 or 4 different teams. So farm Shakti when you can, and put her, let her lead the clones. She actually, this isn't super reliable because your timing has to be just right. But if you run a Shakti clones team that's geared and modded well enough, you can actually go from about 40% of P2 in the Sith raid all the way to the end. And that's worth, I think that's about 100 million points right there, just with one team. Now, you do have to enter in at the right time. Sometimes getting that timing is very tricky, so I wouldn't rely on. That's why I don't run that team, is because the timing is too tricky. I prefer entering immediately with a P1 team and knowing what I'm going to get. But if your guild isn't super fast at taking down the raid, or if you don't have any Night Sister teams to take care of P3 for you, getting Shakti clones and relicking those bad boys will yield heavy dividends for you.
For sure.
So that's number one recommendation. Get Shakti. Everybody should get Shakti. She's great. Second recommendation is once you have farmed up General Anakin Skywalker, he is an exceptional part to a team that I personally run. And I'll describe it briefly. It is General Skywalker lead with Rex and Fives, as well as Grandmaster Yoda and C3PO. And please feel free to message me in Discord if you want to know more about running this team. But the basic idea is you keep 3 stacks of translation on Rex as much as possible, and C3PO Basic will decrease his cooldowns, allowing him to spam his aerial assault. And aerial assault does ramping damage. And it does reset over phases, which is why you don't just completely destroy the entire raid with it. But you can use Grandmaster's Yoda's Foresight to basically dodge everything and all of the AoE attacks that Nihilus does. So even when he's in Enrage, he doesn't kill you because General Anakin Skywalker doesn't take health damage until his protection is completely depleted, and Nihilus doesn't kill your protection. He only goes after your HP. So Skywalker basically is immune to all damage that Nihilus does, with the exception of his Annihilate. So then all you have to do in addition is to time your shields properly, and you can solo that phase deep into Enrage. Anyways, yeah, it's a fantastic team. It does take a little bit of nuance to run. I'm happy to go over with anybody who's interested. So just shoot me a ping on the Discord server if you're interested. Moving on, the third team is Jedi Training Rey. She, at Relics, her team is quite effective in P1. Even if you don't get to Relics, if you get to G12, her team does a significant chunk of P1. And if you can get 3PO, if you rush him, then her team can end up getting something ridiculous like, I don't know, 20 or 30 million with the right strategy and the right mods. So Jedi Training Rey, she's definitely not as good as she used to be, because there are a lot of other teams now that excel in P1, mostly revolving around Rex and the clones. But if you really like Resistance, or if you're going after the Galactic Legend Rey, JTR is a very nice P1 team to be able to get a high score on.
Yeah, and I was gonna say too. So even that 3PO, even if you don't have JTR, I've seen people use that with clones as well.
Yes.
So it's, I mean, he's like R2. You can put him in a whole bunch of squads, and he's gonna just accelerate those teams.
Yep.
To the heavens. So
it sucks. It sucks that you have to farm and gear Ewoks, because I don't listen to the hipsters that say that Ewoks are great when you gear them well enough. They're not. You won't see a single Ewok team in the top 200 of a serious arena shard. Just gear your Ewoks just enough to where you can get 7-star 3PO, and then just leave them on your roster to rot. Unless you just love Ewoks, and then do whatever the heck you want.
I love those murder bears. Got a guy in Tatooine that's planning on having some neon murder bears.
Yeah, well, that's fine. I mean, everybody plays the game differently, right? But if you're serious about winning, don't gear your Ewoks. Pass what you need for 3PO. So the last team that I wanted to touch on real quick before I end the HSTR phase is Supreme Leader Kylo Ren. And of course, this is not something that an early game player is going to have, but you do need to be aware that he, along with several other characters, can solo the entire Sith raid from start to finish in about 15 minutes. So if you if you're in a very competitive guild, or your guild, is going to be very competitive around those top spots in HSTR, you're probably going to want to start farming this guy sooner rather than later, because there will be a point where you won't be able to get top 10 anymore unless you have him. So just keep that in the back of your mind. SLKR is probably going to be really important for mid and late game players. I mean, unless CG releases another character that can solo the entire raid, which I just don't see them doing. And
it's worth noting that when you and I both led our respective guilds through HSTR, I guess SLKR might have been roughly out of run when I did it, but nobody had soloed HSTR with one team yet.
Yes.
So that's the big difference between this raid and Tank and Pit, is that Tank and Pit, you can solo those with several teams, but HSTR, because of the difference in mechanics between phases, it's been damn near impossible until SIKR.
Yes.
So it's a recent occurrence.
Indeed. Yeah. And like I said, I don't anticipate any other teams even really getting close. Yeah. Luke's leadership doesn't affect raid bosses, so he's not going to be the answer either. All right, so yeah, I've pretty much talked the heroic Sith raid to death. Why don't we move on to Geo TV now?
The Senate Alliance, 14 guilds of various galactic power and competitive levels for the beginner and the in-game player, the casual and the competitive. Whether you're US based or international, we have a guild for you. Our guilds are ran independently by their own leadership teams and with their own members. Yet we come together within the Senate's organized Discord server to share many things. The love and sometimes the hate of the Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes game, knowledge and strategy, recruiting efforts, and we help each other to grow stronger and better within the game. We are a community and a family, so we have fun together and we discuss things outside of the Star Wars universe. We don't actively recruit or poach members from other guilds in the Alliance, and there are no feeder guilds. But there are opportunities for players to move to another guild if they meet that guild's requirements or they're in need of a change of pace. So if you're looking for stability and organization, a place to learn and grow, a place to have fun, to play your game, then come check out one of our guilds. And if you want to bring your guild to our Alliance, hop onto the server and we would be happy to discuss adding you to the Senate. Follow the link in the comments and see what the Senate has to offer you. And as always, may the Force be with you. The Senate Alliance.
Alrighty. So we had to take a little bit of an intermission there. So if you see any transition with the audio files, apology for that. We just had to take a little break on account of my baby waking up, to be honest. But so we just went over. Lab just gave a great rundown on HSTR, what to prepare for that from both the player perspective as well as a guild. So now we're going to kind of spend a little bit of time and talk about the other big event. That guilds of that age, if you're worried about getting through your first HSTR, you're probably right around the same timing, if not shortly before or after, going to be tackling your first Geonosis Dark Side territory battle. So, the big things, much like HSTR, you're going to be much more ahead of the game if you think about these types of squads and these requirements before you get to GeoDS. So how do you give a shit about GeoDS, right? That's the big question. Might as well tackle that before we get too much into the requirements. So the big step up with Geonosis compared to Hoth is really, it's kind of two things. One, the overall reward boxes and the gear that you get are much better. And it's a different balance in get 1 versus get 2 currency. So previous to hitting that milestone of tackling GeoDS, you're not really going to have many consistent sources of get 2. Now, get 2 is important, particularly if you're looking at fleets, because the two top ships really that you want for high level meta is going to be Malevolence or Negotiator for the Galactic Republic. Now, I mean, there has been some stuff that's come out recently that's made some of the other fleets a little bit more relevant. Empire Fleet. We've also had Finalizer and the Resistance Fleet, come up to relevancy a bit more, adding some other fleets in the mix. But really, those two are two huge ones that you really want to get after, as soon as you can, in my opinion. So, I will give kind of a future-proof disclaimer here in that we've seen Rolo be a requirement for Jedi Knight Luke. I would be absolutely flabbergasted if we don't see IPD become a requirement at some point, which basically may draw some people towards Hoth Dark Side. I don't think it's going to be the same draw as Rolo. I don't think that's going to be as easy of a pill to swallow for a lot of people that don't already have Imperial Probe Droid. Reason being is just because of the large uptick in rewards that you take from Hoth DS up to Geo DS. Now, there will be people who make the argument that, you know, the get one balance that you get more in Hoth as you get increased stars is good for people chasing Malik and Skywalker. Thank you. So, but in my opinion, I think you're better off if you're a guild around this size, looking at crossing your first GODS. You're better off sticking with Hoth on the light side, even after over the threshold for that one. If you're worried about getting more get one, just because that is the light side of Geonosis is substantially more punishing than the dark side. So that's kind of the overview of why I think it's important. Lab, did you have anything else to add to that part of it before we get into the squads and tunes and all that?
I think I'd just like to kind of emphasize the main point for me, which is, well, there's two main reasons in my mind to do Geonosis as soon as you can. And the first one, as you said, is the get 2 tokens. Your guild will become so much stronger in territory wars once you start unlocking the first either negotiators or malevolences. Even at 5 stars, they compete with 7-star versions of any other capital ship. They're super duper strong. You need to prioritize getting them. And one other thing I would say is, if your guild is about to start doing Dark Side Geonosis, I would highly recommend doing a PSA to all your members. Do not spend the get 2 tokens that we're about to get on gear. Save them and use them to unlock a capital ship in a few months.
Yeah.
Because it's you can get gear from a number of other places. You can only get these capital ships from this one place. And these are the premier capital ships. I don't see that changing for quite a while. So that is the first reason. And the second reason is because the loot boxes, even at lower stars, you get Chirotech out of them. I don't think you get Chirotech out of the Hoth bundles, even if you get max stars. So Chirotech, obviously very important for not just gearing up the newer, stronger characters, but also getting relics. So when you're at the point where you're thinking about Dark Side Geonosis, relics are also going to be at the top of your list in terms of things that you want to start thinking about specifically for your strongest teams. So for those two reasons, even if you're not going to get that many stars on Geonosis, I highly recommend you at least try it out. It's actually pretty fun, unless you just absolutely have no dark side teams. It's not as punishing as some people might make it out to be. And even getting just a few stars, your rewards are going to be greater than getting a bunch of stars in Dark Side Hoth. So carry on, sir.
Yeah. And I think that's a very good point. And I think GODS, with where they set the minimum at 80 million for the guild, even if you're like a pretty flatly distributed guild as far as GP goes, I personally think that it's challenging without being punishing per se. I mean, sure, there's some stuff in the later phases that are you're going to want to put your phone through the wall at a couple times because of RNG and stuff like that. But overall, it's challenging in a good way. It gives you something to strive towards and build towards and progress towards. Much more so than if you hit, with light side Geonosis. If you hit that at the bare minimum, it's way more punishing, I feel like.
It's true. And I'll just emphasize your point by saying that when we started doing dark side Geonosis and there was no light side Geonosis yet, people were like, oh, this is so hard and I don't know how to beat it and blah, blah, blah. Well, that's because, first of all, we didn't know the right teams to use. Most people weren't unlocking all the platoons that you need to make it a lot easier. But nowadays, compared to light side Geonosis, dark side Geonosis is kind of right in that sweet spot of still challenging. So it makes you think. You can't just put it on auto. and get max rewards, but not so punishing where 90% of the player base just wants to deploy and be done with it, like in light side Geo. And I disagree with that, but I'm just saying what the majority opinion is. So anyways,
Right.
carry on.
Yep. No, and I think those are all great points. The caveat to that is I'm here to help you. So there's some good things to chase after as a player. They can make you an early contributor without having crazy squads. Like, you don't necessarily need G12 and relics to start clearing waves in GODS. So you can be a valued contributor to your guild in these events without too much effort. And then I'll also give you some tips on early strat where even if you're a casual guild with reasonable expectations on activity and deployments, you can expect 6 to 9 stars, I feel like, even at a casual guild going in at 80 million, if you play it right. And then we'll also get into a couple other strats that I suggest too. So as far as key squads and tunes, right? So as far as the required tunes that are needed for special missions on GOTV, so there's no huge surprises here, right? It's basically all the separatists minus a couple aren't hard requirements, but you want your Geonosians. They're required for a few different missions. Dooku and Asajj Ventress are required for a special 2-man mission. I say special, but it's just because of the squad configuration. It's not actually, it's just a territory point mission. But it is nice because it's only 2 tunes that you need to worry about. That are also good characters for other squads. So it's only 2 tunes that you have to gear up and everything and worry about. Good characters to have anyway, and you can get a good squad for that mission. Separatist droids, a little bit more of a mountain to climb as far as gearing up. Worthwhile in the end for sure, but they're needed for a few as well. Is needed. Again, he's a good lead anyway to have in your back pocket for a variety of modes for a separatist lead. And then we'll kind of get into, some of the other common squads too. So, but first and foremost, just to address those ones, Geonosians are by far my highest recommendation here for building as an early player for a whole bunch of reasons, right? So they're good in GAC, good in TW, early game arena. You'll be able to climb up to good levels to start getting some decent, rewards and crystals. And really, the main modes, they have 3 pilots in them too, which is great. Good for an early dark side fleet, as well as, they are required for some of the ship missions. Really, the only modes that are not very great at are the raids. They can do a decent chunk of damage out of the pit, but nobody really cares about pit once people start being able to solo it, or once you get it on sim, certainly nobody cares.
You can solo pit with Commander Luke Skywalker, so it's not a big deal.
Yeah, exactly. There's about 10 different squads you can probably more that you can solo it with, so it's not a huge deal. But in the other raids, they're kind of garbo. I do want to note that your first couple of HSTRs, so Geonosians are straight trash in HSTR, but they are capable of shelling out 1 million or 2 million damage or around there in phase 2. Reason I bring that up is when you're first doing HSTR, it can come in handy that if a whole bunch of people are building Geos, throw them all into P2, and it can save some of your other squads that may be useful in other phases. Depending on how you're distributed, a couple million may not sound like much, but if you have 20 people with Geonosian squads that you can throw up phase 2, starts adding up, right? Again, not a recommended squad that I would, expect high damage for, but if you're trying to squeeze through your first HSTR, it's not a bad place to throw them at. But really, when we get back on topic to GOTB, you can start contributing and clearing waves at around like G10, G11. They do not have to be G12 to clear 3 or 4 waves really in the first couple of phases. So really, that I feel like that's your biggest bang for your buck. you know, as far as if you're a early on player, build out your geos as soon as you can, because it'll also get you Padme. It'll let you contribute to your guild when they start doing GODS, as well as even before you get to that point, they're good in Hoth as well. So definitely chase after them. We have some good mod guides out there too about how you're going to want to gear them to when your guild eventually gets to the Watt mission. So Watt Tambor is he's a really strong separatist character that you can only get from one mission in Geonosis Dark Side. In order to do that mission, you need Geonosians, and they need to be G12, really. If you're well modded, you can clear that mission with the proper platoon support with just G12. If you are going to push them to relics, I definitely would prioritize GBA because that beefs up Brute as well. And if you do a second one, prioritize Spy. I don't think it's, I clear it with a relic GBA and the rest are G12. Lab, I think you do it with all G12s, or at least you have, even if you have bumped them to relics.
G12.
Yep. So, and Lab does it consistently. And granted, his mod situation is substantially better than my roster, but you can definitely get the job done. So that is something that you want to think towards, is eventually you do want to bring them at least to G12, so that if, as a player, if you have a squad that's capable of bringing home Watt shards, that's incredibly valuable to your guild. If you hit the open market and are looking for a new guild, also highly valuable.
Let me just jump right in. I've been part of some recruiting conversations for Endor recently, and we're not a competitive guild. We're how do I
casual competitive?
We're not casual, but we're definitely not competitive either. But I can tell you that for anybody who's looking to join Endor, the first thing that me or any of our recruiting officers looks at when you bring your roster in is, what are your geos like? Can you get us Watt shards? It's literally, I should say the first thing is the GP. And then as soon as I look at your GP, I'm doing the filter on Swoga.gg and I'm looking at your geos. So very important team. And even if you don't think they're going to be that much fun, and there's all these other shiny teams that you want to chase, and I don't blame you, there's a lot of shiny teams in this game, and there's a lot of fun teams in this game, but just buckle down and do your geos, get them over with. You'll be glad you did. And to one more point, I completely agree with Mangry here. Geonosians are the #1 team for Darkside Geonosis, and it's not even close. So
it's really not. Even if you look at the other ones that are required for certain battles and stuff like that, that the Watt, even if you're looking at it from a guild leader or officer side, if you can advertise saying you're bringing home X number of shards of Watt every time, that's a huge boon to your recruiting ad, right? Because that's what people want. People want Watt so that they can add him. He's a great plug and play character, great with the Separatists, sure, but throw him in another team too, with his Zeta on, beefs up a tank on defense, or however you want to use him. He's a very versatile character, even outside of Separatists. So
I mentioned Territory War once already, and I'm going to mention it again. Once your guild gets 80 shards of Watt and you unlock him, even at 4 stars, he makes your guild so much stronger. You can put him in a Separatist team. You can put him with a Darth Revan team. You can friggin' stick him with anything. You put him with an Old Republic team if you want. He makes pretty much everything better. And he allows a lot of stuff on offense to beat really strong meta teams that it has no business beating. So, and he works especially well with the new Vader. So, yet another reason why Watt is so important. You need to push for those first 80 shards as quickly as possible, because your guild gets a super big bump as soon as people start unlocking him.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that kind of covers, the squads, cough, cough, geos. Prioritize that. But let's talk a little bit about the other squads that are good outside of the ones that are actually, on paper required for some of these missions.
For sure.
I've
got a list in my head.
Yeah, so some of the common ones that people are going to be farming anyway, a lot of people at that point will have some form of bounty hunters. They do pretty well in a lot of the missions. Can certainly clear. Really your first couple of TBs. If you have a squad that can clear a wave or 2 waves or 3 waves, that's a mission that you have covered, right? Every wave counts at that point. So if you have bounty hunters, that's a common one people have built. They do pretty well. Sith Empire is very strong in it. If you have people that are chasing DR and Malik already, Sith and Empire separately, separate words here, are also pretty strong too. That are common ones that people are going to have. Even if they're not gonna be an easy 4 wave every time, at least those are squads that a lot of people already have built, and can be useful for clearing some waves. So those are the big ones for me. Night Sisters are another strong one that you may not see quite as often, but they are pretty strong. Those are probably the most common ones that I see used outside of the ones that are required. Am I missing any?
You're missing the number 2 dark side team in my book, and that is the Separatist droids.
Yeah. So I kind of skimmed over them earlier because they're required. But yeah, absolutely.
For several special missions in the map, but they are also exceedingly good at going 4 out of 4 once you get them to the proper gear levels. So they are they're the hardest geared outside of maybe Sith Empire in terms of the amount of gear and investment that you're going to have to put into them. But they are very well worth it in pretty much every game mode that you can imagine. So get your SEP droids ready. Like you said, bounty hunters are probably going to be the other main dark side team that early game players are going to have. And I don't want to dissuade anybody from using bounty hunters because they'll clear some waves for you. They don't make my top 4 of useful ones in the mid and late game, but definitely use them if you've got them. Geos,
absolutely.
Geos and Sep droids are 1 and 2 in my book, and everything else is way underneath them. So get those Sep droids ready. That's another one you kind of have to bite the bullet and gear them at some point. They're a fairly expensive gear, but very well worth it. So do what you got to do.
Absolutely. And a little disclaimer here too. A lot of my suggestions and strats here are going to be geared towards early days of going through Geo DS for your guild. By the time you get into the point where you're clearing double-digit stars, mid-teens, and beyond, you know what you're doing. Your guild knows what you're doing. You're in good hands at that point. But yeah, absolutely. Septoroids are I kind of glossed over them a little bit because they're required, but they're also not as common, I would say, to see at that phase unless you're the hot, a higher GP than the rest of your guild at the point that you're unlocking that. But definitely, even if you're not gearing them, be keeping them in your mind, at least for GG on the slow farm. Make sure you're getting him, make sure you're getting the pieces together so that when you do get the gear flowing a little bit better, make sure you get them up and running. Absolutely. So now I'll kind of go over a few of the different platoons and things like that. So why are platoons important? Well, for one thing, they're going to make your general missions more successful. You're going to be able to clear more waves and things like that. But the big thing is when you get to Watt, I'll go over the strat that we use in Tatooine at this point to get to Watt shards at, when we're not really ready for that whole phase, but it's in phase 3. Things hurt at that point when you're a guild that's at, 100 million or 80 million. So it's a challenging phase to get through if you don't have, the platoons in the other zones that support that zone. So when you're looking at the platoons, there are a few things that even as a player you can keep in the back of your mind that, your mileage is going to vary on whether guilds require some of these things or look for them, but they'll definitely be valued. So things like there's some rare tunes that are in those platoons. even in the first couple phases. So DR and Malik, Dart or Fallen Basla, I always call her Nasty Basti, so sometimes I have to remember what the hell her formal name is, but Basla Shan Fallen, Range Trooper, Ebon Hawk, stuff like that, are more rare things that you may not find at the GP that when you first cross that minimum threshold. I'm not saying they're required for you to farm, but they are valued by your guild when you get to that point so that you can fill up as many platoons as you can to tackle Watt and even some of the other missions. Are there any other rare ones that you can think of off the top of your head, Lab?
Imperial Probe Droid.
Yeah.
Is the worst one. And
yeah,
like all those other things can be farmed. The Imperial Probe Droid is just like stuck behind wall after wall after wall, and then you get to Dark Side Geo, and you're not even earning his shards anymore. It's awful. I don't think I'll ever have a 7-star IPD. So
yeah, that's a good point. I did forget about him. So those are just things that keep in the back of your mind that as a player, if you come across and have access to some of those characters, they are going to be valued by your guild. Now, let's talk a little bit about strategy. And Lab, feel free. I know you led Ryloth through this hurdle as well. So if you guys did something different than what I'm going to describe, feel free to chime in. But this is what I've found to work well for Tatooine, to get the most out of the stars. And then we are at the point where even though we're only pulling home a few Watt shards each TB, we're going to keep banging our head against that wall until we get them. And every time that you get it, you get more people, even if they're not clearing it, it's important for them to get experience in that mission. So that when they are beefed up enough to get it, or modded well enough to get it, that's another shard that you can add to your pile for the guild. So really, there's kind of two different approaches that you could take here, each of which are solid and will get you a decent amount of stars, which in turn gets you better gear, right? Now there's a balance of do you push for Watt shards or not? And that really depends on your guild's roster, right? If you have a handful of people at least that have Geonosians that are G12 or higher, in my opinion, it's worth making a push for it. And, like I said, bang your head against the wall, trial and error, get some people with experience in it, and then you'll eventually start landing some shards. First couple times we tried that, or at least the first time, we didn't get any shards, right? We only had a few teams that even qualified for the mission because there is a power minimum on the Geonosians for that. The second and the third time and the fourth time, we brought home at least a few shards each time. Anywhere from one to 4 shards, I think, is what we've brought home each TB. So you may sacrifice a star to do that. So I'm going to kind of give you two different approaches. In both approaches, what I suggest doing is in phase 1, don't even bother trying to start it. Just stage both of the first 2 zones, and then make a push for 3 stars. What we do is we push for 3 stars on the top ones. That way, we can unlock ship zones for phase 3 and 4. So we make a push for 3 stars in the top zone in phase 2, and then in phase 3, what we do is we push the middle of the second row, and that's really just to get to Watt in phase 4. And by the time we get to phase 4, we just push the bottom first row zone all the way up to 3 stars, and then basically lock off everything else in the Watt zone and just have people go after Watt. Now, if you don't think that you can do Watt, probably the safer bet to do would be, instead of pushing that phase 2 second row zone, that mid zone, to as much as you can, which will basically equate to 1 or 2 stars probably at that level of your GP. The safer bet would be stop short of the star and then push for it, and you can probably more securely land an extra star in that extra phase if you're not going to push to that third row zone for Watt. So at a minimum there, I feel like you can at least land about 6 stars. Even if you're playing it safe, even if it's your first time through it. But realistically, in the 80 to 100 million range, you could probably push to, what Tatooine lands is about 9 with pushing to Watt. If we didn't push for Watt, we could probably stretch that to 10. That's it. It's a fairly realistic goal if you just hold those first zones first and stage them as much as possible. Build up your platoons as much as you can. That way you can clear more waves. And then the other big thing that I suggest doing early on when you're first doing GeoDS, if you're guild officer or guild leader, I highly recommend just blocking off the ones that are for just get to currency and focus in really on the ones that are going to bring home territory points. Territory points, you're going to want to squeeze out, as much as you possibly can out of there. So unless people have coverage for all the missions, which if you do have some larger rosters on your guild, that may be the case. So what I do is I just put a note on there to say, hey, ask for officer approval first. And now at this point, people know what they're doing. So I'm like, if you have coverage for the generic dark side missions, have at it, right? And that includes in P1, I even block the Geonosian mission because it requires a POGO lead instead of GBA lead. So for a lot of people, that means they could probably squeeze an extra wave out of it if they did a generic dark side mission rather than doing that specific one. Although in phase 2, I do have them do that because we're really just trying to hammer on that top zone anyway. But when you'll find that your guild as a whole, if you're doing GeoDS, right at 80 million or shortly thereafter, a lot of your guild is not going to be able to do more than 1 or 2 missions in a phase. They just won't have the squads that can then clear some waves. So, in a given phase, there's probably 3 to 4 missions, usually about 3 or sometimes more. Usually there's about 3 or 4 that are just straight up territory point driven. So those are really the ones that I suggest hammering on. And then when you can push up to the Watt zone, focus heavy on that one. So again, TP is really the big ones, the big focus that you want to be zeroed in on to maximize. So that way you can get as many stars as you can. Lab, how about you? What do you suggest doing? I know that's kind of a high level strategy and probably hard for people to visualize necessarily, but did you do much different with Ryloth when you guys first cleared it?
I mean, that's the same thing that we did. That's pretty much what any lower GP guild is going to need to do to get more than like 3 stars, is to just fill them up to the brink before you get that 1 star that allows you on the phase switch to play that territory again, basically. And that's what allows you to get either 2 or 3 stars in the zones. And obviously, if you're not getting lots of stars on a zone on day 1, then it's better to try to get the maximum number of stars on the earlier zones rather than spreading yourself out, because on days 3 and 4, like when you get to the 3rd and 4th slices, it gets significantly harder to clear those waves.
Absolutely.
And it also takes a lot more territory points to earn stars. So yeah, I mean, if you like Mangry just said, it's a little bit hard to visualize this, especially if you haven't done it before. So if this is something that you need help visualizing or you don't quite understand exactly what we're saying, feel free to message us on Discord. We'd be happy to walk you through it. And there are some good videos out there too that kind of show this strategy. Kind of when this territory map was first coming out. Some guilds didn't realize that this was a much better way to do it than just kind of trying to plow your way through on day by day. So yeah, just let us know if you have any questions. We'd be happy to help you out.
Absolutely. And one point too that I want to emphasize, beyond just giving you a chance at more stars by holding yourself back and not starring it immediately, you're also going to give yourself an extra phase to take cracks at the platoons. So you're going to be able to fill out more platoons in those first couple ones. And I will say, particularly that top one, in phase 1. If you can get that up to 6 platoons filled, there's a summonable B2. Is it just a B2 or is it B2 commander or something? I forget the exact term.
Rocket droid, whatever.
Yeah.
Some big.
So you get
droid.
to summon him instead of a B1 commander or something like that. That if you only get 4, so it's a big uptick in the summonable unit that you get available to you in a lot of the squad missions. So it definitely helps you out. You know, that could be the difference between an extra wave for a lot of squads in the later phases, you know, in phase even 2, 3, and 4. So, you know, definitely a good one to try to maximize as many platoons as you can in there. So, but other than that, I mean, that's about all I have for Geo Dark Side. You know, it's a big thing to tackle, but the rewards are worth it. Trust me, when you start doing that the first time after the comparable number of stars that you would be getting in Hoth, the number is going to look a lot lower on the stars, but the gearbox is way better. And like Lab said, you're going to start seeing a lot more G12 finishers, some relic materials, stuff like that. And you're going to start seeing your guild accelerate a fair bit once you get through GODS consistently, as well as HSTR. So those are the big ones that you like. Your guild is definitely going to start having more relics, more G12 tunes, and all that good stuff. So I think both of these events, once you get over these 2 hurdles, your guild definitely takes off a bit. Yeah, so that's what I got. Lab, you got anything else to add on either GODS or even, you know, circling back to HSTR? Any closing thoughts on those 2 events?
I think my closing takeaway would be the teams that I rank highly in terms of clearing waves in Geonosis. Obviously, you want the Geonosians and you want the Separatist droids because of the special missions. And my 3rd and 4th teams would be Night Sisters and an Empire type of a mishmash along with Dark Bastila. If you can get those 4 teams rolling, you will be sitting pretty in terms of the number of waves that you'll be getting at your GP. And circling back to the HSTR segment, remember that the only team that I recommended back for HSTR that also coincides with my recommendation for Geonosis is the Night Sisters. So think about that when you're choosing what squads you want to farm and gear. Yeah,
Night Sisters really are. I was just thinking the same thing, and you kind of beat me to the punch on that. But they really are a team that they're incredibly useful. I get why a lot of people don't chase them early on. Trust me, I do. Without having pilots, there's easier to farm teams up front that get you arena cooking pretty fast. But really, when you do get Night Sisters up and running, so I have one account where I have them farmed but not geared because I just haven't been able to prioritize them. And then on my alt, I actually have them pretty well built up at this point. And I do not regret chasing them at all on my alt. They definitely are a gift that keeps on giving, aside for in fleet. They're good in every other game mode. So definitely recommend that one too.
Yep.
Alrighty. Well, I think that wraps this one. And we'll catch you guys later. You know, hopefully we'll be getting these episodes out a little bit more frequently. Things have been a little bit hectic, just like everybody else. So hopefully we'll be having some cool stuff coming. You know, I think Lab and I each have a couple solo things in the works, as well as we have some fun ideas for a couple new episodes coming out, including potentially, we got to test it out, but we got a couple ideas for a couple you know, more visual episodes too, with you know, a little screen sharing going on and all that stuff. So fun stuff to come. But other than that, till next time, we'll catch you guys later. And you guys have a great rest of your day, whatever it is that you're doing. Peace out.
Thanks for listening, guys.
Peace.